Greetings, Pokey fans! Michael here, and Pokemon type matchups can be confusing. Not only are there a lot of them, with most of the 18 different types having multiple weaknesses and resistances, but also a good chunk of the matchups don't seem that logical at first glance. So in an effort to decrease your confusion, I will be going through every single Pokemon type weakness, resistance, and immunity, and attempting to logically explain all of them. Hopefully these explanations, along with a few other tricks that I'll provide, will help you remember them better. Now if this sounds familiar to you, that is because a couple years ago I made a pair of videos on this same topic. One for weaknesses and immunities, and one for resistances. However, since it has been several years since I made those videos, I wanted to update them and not only improve some explanations, but combine them into one big video. So even if you have seen these videos before, there are going to be several explanations in this one that differ from those, so you still have a reason to watch. Also, one thing I want to cover real quick before we get started, there's one type that has a bit of a weird quirk that I need to go over first, and that is the flying type. The flying type simultaneously represents two different things: wind and air, and birds and other flying creatures. So as a result, my explanations that involve the flying type are gonna vary and kind of switch between something to do with birds and something to do with just wind. So just wanted to cover that before we get started. So don't forget to complete your very important task of leaving a like on this video, and without further ado, let's dive into every Pokemon type matchup explained. We'll go through this list alphabetically, so we'll start things off with the bug type. Bug is weak to fire, flying, and rock. Fire because fire easily incinerates bugs, flying because birds eat bugs, and rock because rocks crush bugs. Bug resists fighting, grass, and ground. Fighting because combat training is rarely useful against an agile bug, grass because plants would just be eaten by a lot of bugs, and ground because covering bugs in dirt usually means they'll just dig themselves out. Fun fact, bug and fighting are the only two different types that resist each other. Next up is dark type, a type associated with evilness, aggression, cruelty, and underhanded battle tactics rather than literal darkness. Dark is weak to bug, fairy, and fighting. Bug because criminals tend to operate at night when bugs are more active and prevalent, and fairy and fighting because of the concept of good versus evil. Fairies represent pure-hearted kindness, and fighting represents honorable combat. Since Pokemon is a kids franchise, good will always prevail over evil, hence why these good guy types win out. Dark resists Dark and Ghost. Dark because a master of underhanded tactics is less likely to fall prey to them, and Ghost because a dark-hearted creature is unlikely to give Eradicate's Frostlass about the woes of the dead. Dark is also immune to Psychic, likely because the fear caused by a truly evil creature can render someone's mind useless. Next up is Dragon type. Dragon is weak to Dragon, Fairy, and Ice. Dragon because of the idea that only another dragon is strong enough to defeat one, Fairy because the pure-hearted hero in fairy tales often slays dragons, and Ice because dragons are reptiles and therefore cold-blooded, thus becoming sluggish if it gets too cold. Dragon resists fire, grass, electric, and water. Fire because dragons breathe fire and therefore are impervious to it. Grass because that same fire breath can easily take care of plants. Electric because dragons with electric powers are actually pretty common. And water because aquatic dragons like sea serpents are also quite common. Next up we have electric type. Electric's only weakness is the ground type. This is due to electrical grounding, the process of redirecting electricity into the insulating dirt, thus dispersing it harmlessly. Electric resists electric, flying, and steel. Electric because adding electricity just increases the total amount. Flying because air, while technically an insulator, isn't a fantastic one as evidenced by the frequency of lightning strikes. And steel because steel easily conducts electricity. Next we have the fairy type. Fairy is only weak to steel and poison. Steel because in many myths, steel is very damaging to fey creatures, and poison because fairies usually have a strong connection with nature. So if the environment is harmed by toxins or pollution, it harms the fairies as well. Fairy resists dark, fighting, and bug. Dark because of the good versus evil thing I mentioned earlier, fighting because martial arts aren't going to be very useful against wielders of magic, and bug because in a battle between two tiny flying creatures, the one incapable of intelligent thought and lacking the hands to carry weapons isn't going to fare that well. Fairy is also immune to dragon. This is because fairies and dragons are both magical creatures. However, it's clear that dragon magic is far outclassed by fairy magic, rendering it useless. Next up is the fighting type. Fighting is weak to fairy, flying, and psychic. Fairy because of magic, easily overwhelming traditional battle tactics, flying because the high ground in a battle usually wins, and psychic because a powerful, intelligent mind that can outsmart an opponent is usually better than raw fighting prowess, hence the term brains over brawn. Fighting resists bug, dark, and rock. Bug because a small bug won't be able to do much against a strong martial arts master, dark because of honorable tactics winning over underhanded ones, and rock because any rocks thrown at a martial arts master would either be broken or dodged. Next up is the fire type. Fire is weak to ground, rock, and water. Ground because smothering a fire with dirt will put it out, rock because of its similar fire blocking abilities, like when rocks are placed around a campfire, and water because water obviously puts out fire. Fire resists bug, fairy, fire, grass, ice, and steel. Bug because the bug would just burn up, fairy because of their nature connection that I mentioned earlier being destroyed by flames, fire because adding more flames would just increase the original fire, grass because the plant would just burn up, ice because the ice would melt, and steel because the metal would just heat up and maybe even melt itself. Fun fact, steel is obviously the type with the most resistances, but fire has the second most. Next up is the flying type, and just a reminder, it is associated not only with birds and flying creatures, but also wind and air. Flying is weak to electric, ice, and rock. Electric because paralysis would prevent a flying creature from using its wings, ice because frosty wings would also be impossible to fly using, and rock because if you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, you can probably kill quite a few more with 1. Flying resists bug, fighting, and grass. Bug because the bug would just get eaten, fighting because the flying creature would be difficult to reach with hand-to-hand combat, and grass because, like bugs, the plants would just get eaten by the birds. Flying is also immune to ground, because anything happening with the ground won't affect something that's flying high above it. After that, we have the ghost type. Ghost is weak to dark and ghost. Dark because cruel, malicious acts or murderous deaths are often what causes spirits to be vengeful and unable to peacefully pass on, and ghost because only other ghosts can touch ghosts. Ghost resists bug and poison. Both are for the same reason. Ghosts are already dead and therefore cannot get sick. As a result, parasites or toxins cannot harm them. Ghost is also immune to fighting and normal. This is because regular creatures or physical attacks will just phase right through a ghost. Next up, we have the type that should have been called the plant type, the grass type. Grass is weak to bug, fire, flying, ice, and poison. Bug because bugs eat plants, fire because fire burns plants up, flying because birds also eat plants, ice because cold enough temperatures can kill many plant species, and poison because weed killer and other toxins can be very effective at killing plants as well. Grass resists electric, grass, ground, and water. Electric because wood is a poor conductor of electricity, grass because strong, tall plants can't have nutrients or sunlight stolen by weaker, smaller plants, ground because plant roots just dig into the dirt and suck up nutrients, and water because those same roots also suck up water. Next is the ground type. Ground is weak to grass, ice, and water. Grass because of what I just said about plant roots, ice because icy ground can render it useless for planting and walking, and water because water washes away dirt in all sorts of scenarios. Ground resists poison and rock. Poison because you can't really poison dirt, and rock because the rocks would just be enveloped by the dirt and turned into dirt themselves. Ground is also immune to electric. This is due to electrical grounding like we discussed earlier. Next up is the ice type. Ice is weak to fighting, fire, rock, and steel. Fighting because if you hit ice hard enough, it'll break. Fire because fire melts ice. And rock and steel because both are much harder than ice and therefore can easily break it. Ice only resists ice. This is due to adding more ice onto ice will just increase the total amount of ice. Next we have the normal type. Normal is only weak to fighting. This is because a skilled martial artist could very easily beat up some regular guy. Normal has no resistances, but it is immune to ghost. This is because while normal people can't touch ghosts, ghosts also can't touch them either. After that, we have the poison type. Poison is weak to ground and psychic. Ground because enveloping toxins in non-poisonable dirt would render them useless, and Psychic because someone with a strong mind can train themselves to have an immunity to certain poisons. Poison resists Bug, Fairy, Fighting, Grass, and Poison. Bug because bugs are helpless against pesticides, Fairy because of their nature connection once again, Fighting because a skilled combatant can't fight as well if they're sick, Grass because plants are helpless against herbicides, and Poison because you can't really poison poison. After that, we have the Psychic type. Psychic is weak to Bug, Dark, and Ghost. The Psychic type has a heavy emphasis on the mind, and few things can inhibit the mind more effectively than fear. Bugs, evil people or malicious criminals, and ghosts are all common human fears, and therefore are the most logical weaknesses for Psychic. Psychic resists Fighting and Psychic. Fighting because of the brains over brawn concept that I mentioned earlier, and Psychic because mind tricks don't work well on others with strong minds, hence Jedi mind tricks not working on other Jedi. Next up we have the Rock type. Rock is weak to Fighting, Grass, Ground, Steel, and Water. Fighting because skilled martial artists can supposedly break stone, Grass because of root wedging, the process of roots digging into rock and breaking it, Ground because over time, rocks eventually become dirt, a process sped up by earthquakes, Steel because steel tools are often used to crack rock, and Water because of erosion. Rock resists Fire, Flying, Normal, and Poison. Fire because rocks don't melt easily and therefore are effective at blocking flames, Flying because even the strongest of winds can't cause huge boulders to move, Normal because regular people can't do anything to rocks, and Poison because toxic sludge would just slide off of a rock. Our second to last type is the Steel type. Steel is weak to Fighting, Fire, and Ground. Fighting because strong enough combatants can dent or bend steel, Fire because it can heat up and melt steel, like what a blacksmith does, and Ground because of earthquakes destroying man-made structures. Steel has a ton of resistances, 10 to be exact, more than any other type. So instead of going through and explaining all 10 of those resistances, since the explanation for all of them would be steel is very strong and durable and this other thing can't do very much to it, I'm instead going to explain the types that steel does not resist, which are of course the 3 that it's weak to, along with Dark, Ghost, Electric, and Water. Dark because evil actions usually aren't carried out against metal, Ghost because ghosts can phase through steel, Water because steel boats don't mind water splashing on them, and Electricity because electricity passes along steel with no damage to either interacting party. Steel is also immune to poison. This is because toxins can't pass through metal. Containers for bioweapons are almost always metal as to prevent any leakage of the toxins. The final type is Water type. Water is weak to Grass and Electric. Grass because of plant roots sucking up water, and Electric because impure water conducts electricity. I specify impure because distilled water is actually an excellent insulator, but typical water, like tap water, is filled with dissolved minerals, which allow it to easily conduct electricity. Side note, since the explanation for water being weak to electric is that water conducts electricity, it's always bothered me that steel isn't also weak to electric. Steel and other metals are far better conductors of electricity than water ever could be, so I feel like that would make a lot more sense. But at least steel doesn't resist it. Water resists fire, ice, steel, and water. Fire because the fire would just be put out by the water, ice because the ice would just float in the water and eventually melt, steel because weapons would just pass through the water, and water because adding more water to water just increases the total amount. Phew, so there we have it. Those are logical explanations for every single Pokemon type matchup currently in the game. Unlike the last videos, I tried not to skimp on any explanations by making silly jokes about them, and instead tried to give at least somewhat passable logical explanations for every single one of them. Hopefully these explanations will help you remember the matchups better. Let me know down in the comments below which explanation was your favorite, and if you have any differing explanations for any of the types, let me know those as well. Also, don't forget to drop a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. I make lots of fun Pokemon videos all the time that I'm sure you will enjoy. Alright, that's all I have for now, so till next time, Pokefans, gotta catch them all!